we need to talk about the beginning, how everything we're watching in FROMVILLE actually began. There are so many dots and so many different things we now know about the origin of how this all began. This video is going to be breaking down all of those details so that you can have a better understanding how canonically and through dialogue we are starting to build up the picture of what From is. Now, before I get into this, I need to briefly talk about something that I'm going to make a separate video on, which is the writer's interview that E-Man recently did that does answer a lot of different things. The writers confirmed one really big thing that got kind of missed by a lot of people who watched the interview that I'm going to talk about in another video. But basically, they are changing things as they go along. That was confirmed by the writers in this interview, that they are changing and making things up as they go along. They understand the base mythology of this show, which is basically what the monsters are, what the symbols they've been using mean, the different cultures that they're pulling from, and they have a general destination ending in mind. But that is not the same thing as what a lot of people in this community have been running with as a story that is actually completely written and finished all the way to the ending since season 1. That has now been debunked. This show is being changed and being made up as it goes along. They are adding plots and side quests and something that they actually coined in that interview as quote unquote happy accidents. And one of the biggest happy accidents that I've been talking about in my videos for a long time, so I cannot help myself but bring it up at the beginning of this one, is that Fatima giving birth to Smiley was not planned. It was never a part of the original story. It was not planned. It was something that they made up as they went along. Them going back to give Fatima the storyline of giving birth to Smiley was something they added after Smiley died because they needed a way to bring him back to life so that he would be reincarnated and they would drive home the point that all the monsters have eternal life. I literally told you guys this because Fatima was pregnant before Smiley died. That is a plot hole. So that to me made it obvious this was something they went back and changed. This was a retcon. They now have confirmed this was a retcon. So all the mental gymnastics that I've been seeing in my comments, it has something to do with the worms and my blood is your blood and Boyd is the grandfather, the grandma is the baby. Does not matter. And they even confirmed that in the interview that those things are not connected. Many other things, they've also debunked a lot of fan theories, including the fact that these people are not in purgatory and this is not a dream. So I'll be making a separate video breaking down all the details in the writer's interview. That'll be up right after this one. But for now, let's get this video done talking about the origin of FROMVILLE, how it all began.
That trick is you find two pieces that connect. Then at least you have a place to start.
Now, looking back and knowing that Jade was supposed to be a woman, there's a couple things that are kind of hilarious about this. But starting with the fact that Jade confirms for us that the best place to start is where two pieces connect. Now, everything we know about the origin of FROMVILLE through the dialogues, through the details of this show, all go back to the cave painting underneath the town. The cave painting that Tabitha and Victor see when they're in the tunnels after Tabitha digs the hole, the beginning of it all, the first piece of knowledge that we get, the thing the man in yellow was afraid of, it all goes back to this cave painting. So I'm going to decipher the cave painting, and as we go along, I'm going to insert dialogue that is relevant to every piece of the cave painting that we are currently at. It is the best way to analyze what we know so far canonically about the beginning of FROMVILLE, the initial sacrifice. It all began with the children. Now, I first want to start off by dating this all to 1506. That is something that has been very confusing to a lot of people across all of my videos whenever I talk about anything related to the mythology in From, is where I'm getting 1506 from. Now, the reason a lot of people were confused is because the monsters themselves are wearing period clothing that some, but not all, which I like to point out, is not all from the 1950s. The reason the monsters are wearing clothes from all these other periods in time that are not 1506, in my opinion, is because, like we've seen canonically in the show, these monsters are curious. They take from the people they kill. They collect things down the tunnels. They put on different pieces of clothes. So I believe this detail can be explained through the fact that they're basically playing dress up. Something we saw being hinted at in the scene with Elgin and Julie when they went into the basement of Colony House. Something we're also seeing hinted at by the fact that what the monsters do when they are out at night, when they got into Colony House, when the bus came to town. These are curious creatures who want to know more and want to talk about things, touch things, take things that hopefully dialogue-wise canonically gets explained later on. But for now, through theory and detail, they're just playing dress up. They're not all from the 1950s, and that everything else we've seen in the show actually places them in 1506. Now, this is how I got to 1506. Now, it's all based off of, again, my landmark theory that I believe confirms that all the numbers in the lighthouse specifically are still years and they are still dates, and that the numbers in the lighthouse specifically are still years, even though we now know the numbers in the Bala Tree were music. Based on my landmark theory, there are buildings throughout FROMVILLE that connect to different timelines, different time periods in America. And all of these time periods connect directly to each one of these numbers in the lighthouse. It is very one-to-one. It's really on the nose. So I would be very, very, very surprised if this ended up being wrong. The fact that this is a cave painting alone dates us into a certain century in time in America. The fact that this mythology that this cave painting is based off of, the symbols it's using that date to Norse mythology, dates us to a specific century. The monsters that these people were created into being very clearly loosely based off of a type of monster that I will talk about later that dates again to Norse mythology and another century. Talismans themselves that use the same symbols from a certain century that are found in cairns in the forest, which dates us again to a specific century of time in America, all to me starts to add up. The symbology of people coming to this place on boats down a river. So the fact that it's caves and cave paintings, cairns and talismans, really early Norse mythology symbols and runes, an early settlement of America. Now, if we assume that the numbers in the lighthouse are dates and the very first date is 1506, and we know that the children were the beginning of it all, so they would be first, having all of these things fit to the 1506 number actually does line up. In 1506, we would have seen a lot of early settlement in America from multiple different European countries, but one of them would include Norse settlers. Some of these settlers would and would not be Christian by 1506. This is not the first Norse settlers in America, nor the first settlers in America, period. It is just that in this time zone, in this year, in 1506, there were Norse settlers coming to the continent of America, and they were both Christian and non-Christian. Some people would actually directly correlate this to the lost expedition of 1506 of John Cabot that has a lot of similarities. However, I do want to point out that in my landmark theory, that they're clearly basing a lot of these different timelines, these different years, loosely on things that happened in those years, but they're not directly referencing those key points. So this is not John Cabot himself, but this is a similar expedition who was lost in the same year. Those hold true for every single number in the lighthouse. Again, a video breaking down all of these numbers will be coming shortly. I have a video already on my channel, but I'm going to do a more in-depth, better explained one again on this channel. So keep an eye out for that. But basically, that is where I get the beginning of From is in 1506. It's from all of that beautiful context through canon and dialogue and background details. So now that we've made that make sense, now let's break down the origin story itself. As we see on the left, we see a bunch of boats coming down a river past normal trees and normal mountains, which is why they're depicted in white. We can assume that anything depicted in white on this wall is considered something normal. So normal people, normal trees, normal mountains going down a river, and then they encounter a tree. Based on this very important detail, FROMVILLE, the pocket dimension, and the entity that controls it already existed. This is something I don't see enough people talking about when deciphering the origin story of what we're seeing happen in the show. This is the origin of the cycles themselves. This is why what's happening in FROMVILLE is happening the way that it is. But FROMVILLE, the pocket dimension itself, where they are and the entity that controls it, predates all of this. So that is something to keep in mind as we continue to watch the show. The children did not create the pocket dimension, and the children did not create the entity. The children were victims of the entity being sacrificed to an existing entity in an existing pocket dimension by the people that loved them. So again, they were the first people to encounter the tree. They got stuck in FROMVILLE too. So as they pass this tree, that's when we jump directly in the cave painting to the actual ritual itself. But I want to talk about what led up to this ritual that we know from some of the dialogue, starting with what the boy in white said. Now, starting with the first half of what the boy in white says, the answers to the end are at the beginning. It started with the children, which now all lines up, because if the children came first and the first date in the lighthouse is 1506, and all the imagery in the show around early settlers, American Norse settlers, mythology, and all those things combined, traveling on boats down a river, it all starts to connect. What the others did to them. The people they loved, the people they trusted. Now, this part particularly gets confused by a lot of people because, like myself at first as well, that made me assume it was their parents. But how could these children be sacrificed by their parents if not all the monsters have the same ages nor are couples? Well, the clarification is it's just the people they loved and they trusted. Not every child is going to have their parents, and not everybody that loves these children and that these children trust is going to be just their parents. We're talking about siblings, grandparents, cousins, friends, mentors, right? Anything that falls within the people they loved, which is why we're able to see monsters that are older and younger throughout FROMVILLE. So that's a canonical reason why some of these monsters are very young. Some of these monsters are not couples. Some of these monsters are very old, because it's simply the people they loved and they trusted. It was all the people in this town who turned on these children and sacrificed them to an entity. Another clarification about the monsters and who sacrificed the children is that we don't actually know how many of them there are. There is no canonical way to prove how many of these monsters exist in FROMVILLE that come out at night. A lot of people have assumed the number we see in this cave painting is the number there actually are. I don't believe that that is accurate. And on top of the fact, there's been so many production changes between actors replacing new monsters that we have not seen return since season 1, that do not match the number of monsters we see at the end of season 3, episode 10. So there is no way, integrity wise, that I can sit here on this video and pretend to know the answer to how many monsters there are. No one in the FROMVILLE can. We can only guess, and I'm not willing to guess any number, so I'll leave that for the writers to prove to us later down the line. They were born in the dark and then they were murdered in the dark. So again, these children were born to be sacrificed. They never had real childhoods. They were born in order to be sacrificed, raised as sacrifices in these caves, and they were kept in the cages that we see when Tabitha and Jade do go into these caves. That's why the children also look the way they do, right? If you know anything about feral children, when you're raised in the dark, you never leave the dark of a cave, for example. You are going to look gray, pale, sickly, like you're already dead. So even though we know the children currently in our timeline of FROMVILLE we're watching right now are deceased, I believe they always look the way that they look as they're projecting because they were raised in the dark. Now, a few things I want to point out about this before we move on to the rest of what happened in the beginning. Number one, if you take away the dirt and the decay or the feralness of these children, they are also wearing white. Could this be why and how the boy in white knows so much about the origin of FROMVILLE and what happened to these children? Because he himself was one of them and he was supposed to be sacrificed, a missing 8th child. That is hinted at by the merry-go-round itself. The merry-go-round has an 8th seat. knowing that there are only 7 children who were sacrificed, but we see imagery of 8 children on a merry-go-round. Is this another hint that there is a missing child that is potentially the boy in white? But also now begs the question that if these children never left the caves, how did they end up on this merry-go-round? A lot of questions we need to answer. Before we go ahead even further than this, I want to talk about what Fatima confirms for us, which is that they sacrificed their children because it promised them eternal life. Now, the question number one is, who is it, right? Who is this entity that they sacrificed their children to? Now, I don't personally believe that the entity, the big bad, the thing that's actually in control of all of FROMVILLE is the man in yellow. It's not the man in yellow, and it's not the kimono lady that they sacrificed their children to. I believe they are the higher level generals to something else that is in more control. Now, this higher level entity could be represented by the large red and black symbol on the wall, which could feed into the King in Yellow, the Cthulhu mythos, and H.P. Lovecraftian genre that is very clearly influencing this show. Now, the symbol could also be the transformation that people went through to become the monsters. That is very 100% very close to being true. I have seen the theories that the thing on the wall looks like Smiley when he is coming out of that encasement that Fatima gives birth to. And now this is the problem with when you change things as you go, because that then creates another plot hole. Because if that symbol does turn out to be how Smiley looked when he came out of the encasement that he was reborn in through Fatima's birth process, and now the writers are familiar with that theory through the interview and end up adding it to the show like they've done quite a few other things, how do you explain that symbol representing the process that every single one of the other monsters went through? How were every single one of the other monsters reborn through the same process of somebody who was pregnant basically getting their baby possessed? I find it hard to believe that they magically had 10 to 20 something women give birth to every single one of the monsters we've seen in the show. Similar to how I find it hard to believe Ethan, just because he wears yellow in season 1, is the man in yellow. So that opens up a can of worms that I'm hoping doesn't even get touched and doesn't get retconned like we've seen already happen before. And this is what happens when you change things as you go along and the story itself is not actually written. It promised them eternal life. Now, this is something I've seen get really confused for people because, number one, who and why would you sacrifice your children? We're all on the same page on that, right? I hope we're all on the same page on that. However, in the process of wanting eternal life, these people signed up to be monsters? Well, the answer to that is no. So what they're probably going to explore through this plot detail, that is a trope we've seen before that mirrors real life, to be honest, which is be careful what you wish for. Like you've seen a million times, whether it's genies in a bottle, jinns themselves, making deals with anything, deals with the devil, deals with fairies, whatever dark magic or magical thing that you're making a deal with in exchange to receive something else, there is always a caveat. There is always something you give in return. There is always a trick or something to it more than what it seems at face value. And that's probably what is going to be explored by what happened when they sacrificed their children. This is proven by in canon dialogue when Jasmine was led into Colony House after she says, "I didn't choose to be this way." I believe this is foreshadowing the fact that all of these people sacrificed their children for eternal life that they thought they were going to get in a better way. Now, something I want to think about because of the fact that we now know FROMVILLE, the pocket dimension, and this entity existed before all of this, is that did they end up in this pocket dimension, were in danger, and they sacrificed their children for eternal life and salvation from what they were already dealing with? Or were they already seeking out this entity and this pocket dimension before they got here in search of salvation and eternal life? And when they got here, in order to get eternal life, they were told to sacrifice their children for it. Couple different ways that this could have happened and how this could have led up to them eventually basically being tricked. But they were seeking eternal life for a reason. This eternal life that they wanted was not the eternal life that they got. They made a deal with the devil, whoever this entity was in FROMVILLE, and got a different type of eternal life than they were looking for. They did not choose to be this way. The initial game and the initial trick that was played on the people of FROMVILLE, because this entity that we're messing with clearly loves games, it loves playing tricks. What you give and what you take, no good deed goes unpunished. Everything you receive, I get something in return. That is something that is very central to whatever entity we're dealing with. It promised them eternal life, but didn't tell them it would be eternal life in the form of being monsters. Now, what they were turned into, what kind of monsters they are, another video. But this thing turned them into what they are now. And that was not what they thought they were getting. Nobody wants to live forever and only be able to come out at night. Nobody wants to live forever and be ghostly creatures that feed on other human beings, right? Of course, that was not the plan. So again, they were tricked into becoming these monsters that are very clearly also under the control of this entity. And now I believe this clear process of being a person in FROMVILLE who encounters this entity and in exchange for something becomes an entity and a part of FROMVILLE is something we're seeing mirrored across the entire show, including some of the other entities. Like I mentioned in previous videos, the man in yellow could potentially be someone who used to be in FROMVILLE. Martin also is someone who used to be in FROMVILLE who could be an entity. And now with this in mind, the Obume ghost kimono lady could also be someone who used to be in town and was turned into an entity, evidenced by details about them, clothing in the show that shows us that they might have been in this town in the past and now are entities themselves. This would mirror the original entity, the ones that come out at night, who used to be members of people who came to FROMVILLE and were turned into the entities we see now. I believe it is all connected. Now that we know this, let's go back to what the boy in white later continues to say. But someone who loved them told them a story, and the story gave them hope. Who told them what story? Now, this has a couple different theories based off of the cave painting and also based off the dialogue of the canon that we have. Starting with dialogue and canon, we now know that Jade and Tabitha are two reincarnated versions of two people who were there for the original sacrifice, but did not want to participate. And now this actually further builds upon my landmark theory, because we've seen through Jade's vision and Tabitha's visions that these people that they're seeing that are the past versions of themselves fall into timelines as people who would be present during these dates. So again, I still believe the lighthouse is dates. The same way Jade has seen Civil War soldiers, pilgrims, and etc. that are all past versions of himself, the same way Tabitha is seeing the same thing, past versions of herself that align with the dates in the lighthouse. And now we know that this reincarnation cycle began because the two original versions of themselves who were in FROMVILLE in the beginning, who were there during the child sacrifice, had a child together who was chosen to be one of the children who were sacrificed to this deity. And I'm going to explain later how them being reincarnated ties back to this deal, this contract that everyone signed with this entity when they sacrificed the children. But through the same dialogue, we learn through Jade that Tabitha and Jade used to sing these children lullabies. So again, Jade and Tabitha were not only trying to save their own child, but they were there talking to all of the children who were supposed to be sacrificed. They would sing them lullabies in the caves. So is it far-fetched to believe that Jade and Tabitha are the ones who told them the original story as well? That is a possibility. That is one that I believe is probably the easiest answer and is probably the most likely answer. Now, comparing this dialogue to what we actually see in the cave painting, now that we have gotten to the actual point of sacrifice, we see that there are all the people lined up ready to sacrifice the children, yet there are two stick figures that are off to the side. It is easy to probably say that this is most likely Jade and Tabitha in the retelling. However, because of the proportions of the stick figures, it has started a couple different theories on these stick figures actually being Julie and Ethan, or Julie and the boy in white, since one of these stick figures is a lot smaller than the other. And now that we know Julie is a story walker, it is possible that she went back to the beginning and is the one who told the children the story. Now, whether this is Ethan or the boy in white that is with Julie is dependent on the fact that, number one, if you think it's Ethan, it's most likely because he would be the one who would tell them the story, as he is very clearly the one who's much more closely tied to knowing stories and telling stories. However, it could also be in the boy in white, because that could be how the boy in white escaped being sacrificed, is that Julie or somebody story walked back into the past and saved at least one of the children. Or the easiest answer is that it is simply Jade and Tabitha. The proportions of the stick figures aren't actually an important detail. And then it easier explains the rest of the cave painting, where we continually see these two people come back, hinting at the infinite cycles and the two people who always come back to FROMVILLE, which I will talk about more at the end of this video. Now, sticking to the order and returning back to the rest of what the boy in white had to say, when the children lay on the stones, they poured their hope into the roots, and that became the symbol, and those roots became the tree. So again, I predicted this in one of my past videos. The symbol that Jade was seeing was something that the people who passed away and were trying to contact him and Tabitha were putting into his mind, and that's exactly what it was. It's a trope we've seen before, where when somebody lays dying and they're looking at something as they're dying, they hold on to that symbol and they use that to try to communicate with people that they need help from, because they need help being found, being freed, having their soul freed, whatever it is, right? That is exactly what the symbol was. I told you guys many videos ago, before it was revealed to us, that those roots were the actual symbol, that the roots that Jade had seen in season 1 was what he was actually looking for. And those roots would be the roots to the faraway trees. So now that you have the context of FROMVILLE already existed, this entity already existed, this entity was in control of this pocket dimension before. Now you know that on top of that, these children created their own thing within this pocket dimension. Are these the answer to getting out of FROMVILLE? Potentially, based off of what the boy in white said. However, what else about FROMVILLE was already here versus was created by the children? Now, this is where we can reach into a convoluted theory that I'm working on about how the children are the ones who created all of the buildings that currently exist in FROMVILLE. The motel pool with no motel gets explained by this. Starting with number 1, a lot of people are just now picking up on a detail I've caught a long time ago and mentioned in previous videos, that there are colors that are repeating throughout the show, mainly blue, red, and yellow. I believe this is an intentional detail, but as I've continued to try to put together what it means, and some people are deciding what those things mean for other reasons. For example, people thinking because Ethan wears yellow, he is the man in yellow. As I've deciphered how many times these colors pop up, when and where and on who, there is no real pure pattern that deciphers a meaning or a foreshadow to who these people are. However, what I did pick up on is that throughout the entire show, even the buildings themselves, they all pretty much stick to these consistent colors, which in theory are primary colors. Now, what better way to delineate that we are living within the creation of the child than using primary colors like a child would? So this is a working theory that I have, that the reason there's a motel pool with no motel, the reason that a lot of these buildings don't quite make sense, the reason they're easy to destroy themselves and build back up, the reason that there's so many repeating colors, and the fact that these children are now basically confirmed to be the battery pack underneath FROMVILLE. Everything we're currently seeing in FROMVILLE, every building, everything that there is, was created by the memory of the children based off of the story that they were told. And again, this does not mean that FROMVILLE is a dream. The writers have now confirmed that FROMVILLE is not a dream, nor is it purgatory. However, it is a physically existing place, another dimension that exists outside of time that you can physically be inside of. But that does not mean the things within this dimension are not created. And I believe that all the things we're seeing in FROMVILLE were created by the minds and by the hope of the children, just like the faraway trees. Now, to finish off the rest of this cave painting, we need to talk about the two returning souls, Jade and Tabitha. Now, what I believe is actually the second half of this cave painting after the large symbol that can be the entity or can be the process that these people went through to become monsters is actually the next cycle, the 1609 cycle by the village with the crops. I believe that's what is drawn on the wall. And around these crops are all of the monsters depicted now in red who used to be people that we now see come out at night today. But the two people who are coming back to FROMVILLE and encountering the village are Jade and Tabitha. They're reincarnations from the 1609 cycle. And the rest of this painting depicts the two souls who are destined to always come back in an infinite repeating cycle that all connects, which is depicted by the infinity symbol with the line through it. It is a line that connects all of these timelines that is an infinite loop that all happens at the same time. Just like the quote in the diner, forever is composed of nows. All of these timelines coexist with one another. All of these different dates have always existed in FROMVILLE. All of the buildings connected to all of these dates have always existed in FROMVILLE since the first sacrifice. And that is what we're seeing play out in FROMVILLE, is the story of these two souls destined to reincarnate. And eventually, which will be the ending of the show, hopefully, they figure out how to save the children. And it knows what is happening. It knows what should happen. It is watching everyone, and it believes that these people will never be able to overcome it, that these people will never be able to beat it, and these people will never be able to beat the game, beat the quest. And this game and this quest is what the entity feeds off of. It feeds off of not just the fear and the torture of the people in the town, but it feeds off of the hope of trying to beat this quest, of trying to save the children. So it is in this entity's best interest to reincarnate Jade and Tabitha over and over and over again to play its infinite game. A game we know that this entity is notorious for, and this entity itself loves to play games. This is also hinted at through the background details of the entire show, where there's games literally all over the place. So I believe that is what's happening in FROMVILLE. This is how it all began. The details, the canon, and the dialogue of everything you need to know about how this all began and why it's playing out the way that it does. And a few questions we need answered in future episodes and future seasons to make it all make sense. And if you believe my landmark theory, which could be wrong, but I believe it is right, the year that is in the lighthouse represents every time these two reincarnated souls end up back in FROMVILLE. And it lines up with Jade's visions, Tabitha's visions, the buildings in the town, the details of everything we know about the town, and everything else. So I believe my landmark theory is correct, but again, it's just a theory and it could be wrong. Now, to wrap it all up, TLDR. A bunch of people traveling in boats in 1506 came to FROMVILLE, and FROMVILLE and the entity that was here already existed. Whether it was by accident or on purpose is yet to be seen. They get here, they interact, they find out there's an entity here, and they sacrifice children to this entity, children that they've raised in caves since birth that were intended to be sacrifices since birth. Two people break off from this initial sacrifice while the rest of them willingly participate. Everyone who willingly participated got turned into monsters. The two separate people who used to sing lullabies to the children in the caves and were trying to save their own child, who probably also tried to stop the sacrifice, were unsuccessful, but are now punished by the entity for all of time to reincarnate over and over again and come back to this pocket dimension in order to play out a game that we know this entity likes to play. This entity does not think that it can be beaten, which is why it allows this process to continue. It feeds off of the misery, the hope, and the fear of everyone who comes to FROMVILLE, including the two that get reincarnated every couple years and fail to save the children. The rest of the people from that sacrifice are monsters doomed to come out at night who were tricked into becoming monsters in exchange for eternal life. They did not choose to be this way. the story we're watching play out is in reverse of how do we figure out what is going on in FROMVILLE as we continue to learn about the original story of the children and how this all began and who the entity that controls all of this truly is. Hopefully we get those answers soon and the rest of the story can play out. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I hope it wasn't too confusing. And I'll see you guys in the next one.